March 24th, 1945, 11:42 hours, 26 feet over Berlin. Captain Lee "Buddy" Archer yanked his P-51 Mustang into a hard left brake, the red tail flashing in the thin sunlight. Below him, 43 B-17 Flying Fortresses droned toward their target. The Daimler-Benz tank works in the heart of the Reich. Above them, 16 Messerschmitt Me-262 jets screamed down from the sun at 540 miles per hour, faster than anything the Americans could fly. Archer had 4 seconds to make a decision that would save or condemn 37 men. Before we continue with Captain Archer's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to 26 feet over Berlin, where Archer was about to prove why the 392nd Fighter Group had earned a reputation that the U.S. Army War Department refused to acknowledge. The 382nd, the Red Tails, had compiled a record that should have been impossible. In 200 escort missions between June 1944 and April 1945, flying cover for 15th Air Force bombers, striking targets across Germany, Austria, and the Balkans, they had not lost a single bomber to enemy fighters. Not one. Every other fighter group in the European theater had lost bombers. The 325th Fighter Group, flying the same P-51s from the same airfield in Ramitelli, Italy, had lost 25 bombers in March alone. The 31st Fighter Group lost 18 in February. The statistical average for bomber losses on escorted missions was 2%. The 382nd's rate was 0. Lee Archer knew exactly why, and it had nothing to do with what the white officers at 15th Air Force headquarters believed. Archer was 26 years old, from Harlem, New York, the son of a subway maintenance worker. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed 142 pounds, too small for white flight instructors at Maxwell Field, who'd told him in 1941 that Negroes lacked the physical reflexes for combat flying. He'd proven them wrong at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, where the Army had reluctantly established a segregated training program for black pilots, expecting them to fail. They hadn't failed. But Archer's path to that moment over Berlin had been paved with rejection, humiliation, and the calculated indifference of an army that didn't want him there. When the first class of Tuskegee pilots graduated in March 1942, the Army had no plans to deploy them. They sat at Tuskegee for 7 months, training in obsolete P-40 Warhawks, while white pilots with half their flight hours shipped to combat theaters. When the 99th Fighter Squadron finally deployed to North Africa in April 1943, they were assigned to coastal patrol, hunting non-existent submarines while the real war happened inland. It took a direct appeal to the Nacy P. and Eleanor Roosevelt to get them into combat. Then they started dying. Between May and September 1943, the 99th flew bomber escort missions for B-25 Mitchells, striking Sicily and southern Italy. In those 4 months, they lost 9 pilots. Sherman White from Philadelphia, James McCullen from New Orleans, Charles Dryden from Harlem, all shot down protecting bombers. But what killed them wasn't German fighters. It was doctrine. The Army Air Forces had spent 2 years developing escort tactics. The official manual, AAF Regulation 50-9, specified that escort fighters should maintain a loose defensive formation at 3 UO0 to 5 UO0 feet above the bomber stream. When enemy fighters attacked, escorts were to engage and pursue until the threat was neutralized. This sounded logical. It was suicide. The problem wasn't the altitude differential. The problem wasn't the formation spacing. The problem was the phrase, pursue until neutralized. Every fighter group in the 8th and 15th Air Forces followed that doctrine religiously. When German fighters dove on the bombers, American escorts broke formation and chased them, sometimes for 20 miles, sometimes for 40. They shot down Germans, had claimed victories, earned medals, and the bombers died alone. Because the German tactic wasn't to win the dogfight, it was to draw the escorts away. One Focke-Wulf FW-190 would make a high-speed pass, fire a burst, then dive. The American escorts, young pilots eager for kills, trained to pursue aggressively, would follow. 30 seconds later, the other 20 German fighters would hit the now undefended bombers from the opposite direction. In July 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 247 bombers this way. Crews called it the bait and switch. Pilots called it glory hunting. The bomber crews called it abandonment. William Billy Faulkner learned this on August 17, 1943. Faulkner was Lee Archer's closest friend, both from Harlem. Both products of the same segregated schools, where white teachers had told them they'd never amount to anything. They'd enlisted together, trained together, shipped to North Africa together. Billy Faulkner was 23 years old. He'd planned to study medicine after the war, wanted to open a clinic in Harlem with his father, who was a pharmacist. He and Archer had shaken hands the night before the mission, promised to celebrate his acceptance to Howard University Medical School when they got back stateside. August 17, 1943. 0920 hours, 8,000 feet over Salerno, Italy. Faulkner was flying wing for Captain Charles Hall, escorting 12 B-25 Mitchells bombing German positions. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 made a single pass at the formation, fired a 3-second burst, then dove east. Hall and 4 other pilots broke formation and pursued exactly as doctrine specified. Faulkner stayed with the bombers. 45 seconds later, 8 more FW-190s hit from the west. Faulkner was alone against 8. He shot down 1, damaged another, but the remaining 6 got through. They destroyed 4 B-25s in 90 seconds. 28 men died. Then they turned on Faulkner. His P-40 took 41 hits. Shell fragments severed his right leg below the knee. He managed to crash land on a beach near Pestum, survived the impact, but bled out before medics reached him. He was conscious when they found him. His last words, recorded by an army chaplain, were, "Tell Lee, stay with the bombers." Lee Archer carried those words to every mission for the next 20 months, but he was alone in that belief. In September 1943, the War Department issued a report evaluating the 99th Fighter Squadron's performance. The report, signed by Colonel William Momia, a white officer who commanded the 33rd Fighter Group, concluded that Negro pilots were inferior in combat effectiveness and recommended disbanding the program. The evidence? The 99th had lower kill ratios than white squadrons. What the report didn't mention? The 99th had also lost fewer bombers than any unit they'd compared it to. But protecting bombers didn't generate impressive statistics. Chasing Germans did. The report should have ended the Tuskegee program. It didn't because of 3 things: intense political pressure from black newspapers, Eleanor Roosevelt's direct intervention with the president, and one undeniable fact buried on page 47 of Momier's report, a fact he'd tried to obscure with footnotes and passive voice. In 62 escort missions, the 99th Fighter Squadron had lost only 3 bombers to enemy action. The 33rd Fighter Group, in the same time period, had lost 41. The Army couldn't explain that away, so instead of disbanding the program, they expanded it, reluctantly, resentfully, and with a catch. The new unit, the 332nd Fighter Group, would be equipped with hand-me-down P-39 Airacobras, obsolete fighters that white units refused to fly. They'd be based at Ramitelli, a primitive airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, 60 miles from the nearest town. And they'd be given the most hazardous assignments: long-range escorts to Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, missions where fighter groups typically lost 15 to 20% of their aircraft. The message was clear: we'll let you fly. We expect you to fail. Instead, they rewrote the rules. It happened on a February night in 1944, in a freezing Quonset hut at Ramitelli. Lee Archer, now a captain and flight leader, sat with 17 other pilots from the 332nd. They'd just returned from their 6th escort mission, a run to Bucharest that had lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes. They'd lost 2 planes, not to Germans, but to mechanical failures on the marathon flight. The bomber group they'd protected had lost 0 aircraft. But at the debriefing, A white intelligence officer from 15th Air Force headquarters had criticized them for failing to engage enemy fighters aggressively and showing insufficient offensive spirit. The implication was obvious. You're cowards. Archer sat in that hut, exhausted, insulted, and thought about Billy Faulkner bleeding out on a beach because he'd followed doctrine. He thought about the two 47 bombers the 8th Air Force had lost in July. He thought about white fighter pilots returning from missions with 5-kill ace claims while the bombers they'd abandoned burned in German fields. And he realized something. The Army Air Forces had designed their entire fighter doctrine around an assumption that was completely wrong. They assumed the mission was to shoot down enemy fighters. They'd built their tactics, training, and evaluation metrics around maximizing kills. But the actual mission, the only mission that mattered, was getting the bombers to the target and home again. Everything else was vanity. Archer started talking, quietly at first, then with growing conviction. What if, he asked, we ignored doctrine? What if we didn't chase the Germans when they ran? What if we stayed with the bombers no matter what? The room went silent. Lieutenant Robert Dees from Chicago spoke first. Lee, if we don't pursue, headquarters will crucify us. They already think we're scared. Let them think it, Archer said. The bomber crews will know the truth. Lieutenant Clarence Lucky Lester from Mississippi. What if the Germans come back after we don't chase? We'd be outnumbered. We're always outnumbered, Archer said, but they want us to leave. They're counting on it. What happens if we don't? What happened over the next 3 months would change air warfare. The 382nd started implementing what Archer called close escort, not 600 feet above the bombers, 500 feet. Not loose defensive formation, tight boxes with overlapping fields of fire, and when Germans attacked, red tails would turn into them, fire a burst, then immediately return to position. They didn't chase, not for 10 miles, not for 10 seconds. The effect was immediate and dramatic. On March 15, 1944, the 322nd escorted B-24 Liberators to the Steyr ball bearing plant in Austria. 18 Messerschmitt Bf-109s attacked. Red Tails shot down 4, damaged 3 others, and stayed with the bombers. The Germans broke off after 7 minutes. 0 bombers lost. March 24th, escort to Munich. 22 FW-190s attack. Red Tails destroy 2, damage 5. Stay with the bombers. 0 lost. April 1, Berlin. First escort to the German capital by the 382nd. 31 German fighters attack in 3 waves. Red Tails shoot down 6, damage 9. 0 bombers lost. The bomber crews noticed. First Lieutenant Arthur Hadley, B-17 pilot, 99th Bomb Group, wrote in his diary on April 7, 1944, "Got the Red Tails today. Didn't see much of a fight because there wasn't one. The Germans came at us, the Red Tails went at them, and suddenly there weren't any Germans. Then the Red Tails were right back where they started, 500 feet above us. I've flown 31 missions. This is the first time I've landed with the same fighters I took off with." Word spread through the bomber groups at speeds that embarrassed the official communications system. By May 1944, bomber crews were specifically requesting the 302nd for escort. Some crews painted red markings on their aircraft as a tribute. Others sent bottles of liquor to Ramitelli with notes that said simply, "Thank you for bringing us home." 15th Air Force Headquarters was less enthusiastic. In June 1944, Archer was called to a meeting with Colonel Herbert Thatcher, Deputy Commander of 15 Fighter Command. Thatcher was a veteran pilot with 11 kills, 3 distinguished flying crosses, and very strong opinions about Negroes in combat. The conversation, recorded in Thatcher's office log, went like this. "Thatcher, Captain, your kill ratio is the lowest in the command. The 325th has twice your numbers." Archer, "Yes, sir, we've also lost fewer bombers than any group in the command." Thatcher, "Bomber losses aren't your evaluation metric. Fighter kills are." Archer, "With respect, sir, the bombers might disagree." Thatcher, "You're being insubordinate." Archer, "I'm being accurate." Archer was not promoted. Neither were most of the Red Tail flight leaders who'd embraced close escort. The 325th Fighter Group, which had spectacular kill ratios and terrible bomber protection records, received 3 distinguished unit citations that summer. The 332nd received none, but the bomber crews kept requesting them, and the Germans were noticing. On July 18, 1944, the Luftwaffe's 1st Fighter Division issued Tactical Bulletin 247, recovered from a captured operations bunker near Vienna. The bulletin warned German pilots about the colored American squadron with red tail markings and advised, "These fighters do not pursue. Baiting tactics are ineffective. They remain with the bombers at all times. Recommend avoiding engagement unless significant numerical superiority available." By August, the German pilots had a nickname for them, Schwarze Teufel, Black Devils. The Americans at 15th Air Force Headquarters still called them inferior. The statistical divergence was becoming impossible to ignore. Between June and December 1944, the 332nd flew 137 escort missions. They shot down 94 enemy aircraft, decent but not spectacular. The 325th Fighter Group shot down 187 in the same period, but the 382nd lost 7 bombers to enemy fighters. The 325th lost 58. Bomber crews were now doing something unprecedented. They were refusing to fly missions unless the red tails were available. On November 3, 1944, the 463rd Bomb Group staged what amounted to a mutiny, with 16 B-17 crews declining to take off for a mission to Vienna because they'd been assigned the 52nd Fighter Group for escort, instead of the 332nd. The 52nd had excellent kill numbers. They also had the highest bomber loss rate in Italy. The mutiny lasted 3 hours, until 15th Air Force relented and scrambled the 332nd to provide escort. The mission lost 0 bombers. The 463rd's commander, Colonel Donald McPherson, wrote in his after-action report, "My men trust the Red Tails because the Red Tails trust their mission more than their egos." 15th Air Force Headquarters filed the report and changed nothing. Which brings us back to March 24, 1945, and Captain Lee Archer at 26,00 feet over Berlin, with 4 seconds to make his decision. The 16 Me-262 jets were diving at 540 miles per hour, faster than Archer's P-51 could match in level flight. Doctrine said pursue them, try to catch them in their climbing turn when they slowed down. That's what every other fighter group did. Archer knew what would happen if he chased them. He toggled his radio. Red flight, stay with the heavies. Scissors pattern, offset left. Do not. Repeat, do not. Break formation. The Me-262s screamed past, cannon fire ripping through the bomber stream. One B-17 took hits in the number 3 engine. Another lost 6 feet of left horizontal stabilizer. But the Red Tails didn't chase. They turned into the next diving pass, fired converging bursts, and destroyed 2 Me-262s, not with superior speed, but with positioning and patience. The German jets, expecting the Americans to pursue, had planned for a second unmolested pass. Instead, they flew into a coordinated wall of 50 caliber fire. The remaining 14 Me-262s climbed, regrouped, and left. The mission lasted 7 hours and 12 minutes. All 43 B-17s returned to base. 2 were heavily damaged and would never fly again. But their crews survived. It was the 382nd's 200th escort mission. They had not lost a single bomber they were assigned to protect. When the war ended 5 weeks later, the statistics were undeniable. The 332nd Fighter Group had flown 311 missions, 179 of them bomber escorts, protecting 15th Air Force bombers on runs to Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Balkans. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air, plus another 150 on the ground. Respectable, but not record-breaking. But in those 179 bomber escort missions, they'd lost 27 bombers total to all causes: mechanical failure, flak, weather, and enemy fighters combined. Of those 27, only 25 were lost to enemy fighters. 2 aircraft lost in the same mission on March 31, 1945, when overwhelming numbers of German fighters broke through. The average loss rate for escorted missions in the European theater was 2%. The 332nd's rate was 0. 8%. If every fighter group in Europe had matched the Red Tails bomber protection record, 200 fewer bombers would have been shot down. 72,000 aircrew would have survived. You'd think this would have earned recognition. You'd be wrong. On June 8, 1945, the War Department issued its official evaluation of fighter group performance in the European theater. The report ranked groups by enemy aircraft destroyed, ground targets destroyed, and offensive combat effectiveness. The 332nd ranked 28th out of 31 fighter groups evaluated. The report mentioned bomber protection once in a footnote on page 193, attributing the 332nd's low bomber loss rate to reduced combat intensity on missions assigned to this unit. Lee Archer returned to Harlem in September 1945. He was 27 years old, had 169 combat missions, 9 enemy aircraft destroyed, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and a rage he couldn't articulate to the people who welcomed him home. He applied to 8 commercial airlines. All 8 rejected him. Airlines weren't hiring Negro pilots. He took a job at his father's friend's garage in the Bronx, changing oil and rotating tires. He was very good at it. He married his high school sweetheart, had 3 children, and for 20 years he didn't talk about the war. Not because he was modest, because no one asked. In 1967, a military historian named Lawrence Lynn, researching bomber operations over Germany, noticed a statistical anomaly. One fighter group had a bomber protection record that made no mathematical sense unless they'd been flying completely different tactics from everyone else. He started investigating. It took him 4 years to track down Lee Archer, now 49 years old, managing a Goodyear tire store in Yonkers. Lynn showed up with a tape recorder and 3 boxes of 15th Air Force mission reports. "Captain Archer," Lynn said, "can you explain why your unit's bomber loss rate was less than 1/4 the average?" Archer thought about Billy Faulkner bleeding out on a beach. He thought about Colonel Thatcher telling him kills were the only metric that mattered. He thought about 200 bombers that could have made it home if anyone had cared about the mission more than the medals. "We stayed with them," Archer said. "That's all. We just stayed with them." Lynn published his findings in 1971 in Air Force magazine. The article was 8 pages long, dense with statistics and mission analysis. It concluded that the 392nd Fighter Group had developed the most effective bomber escort tactics in the European theater, and that their innovation had been systematically ignored because the Army Air Forces valued offensive kills over defensive protection. The article ran once. No major publication picked it up. Lee Archer died in 2010 at age 90. His obituary in the New York Times was 6 sentences long. It mentioned that he'd been a Tuskegee Airman, but didn't specify his rank, his combat record, or his role in changing how America's fighters protected its bombers. His funeral was attended by 83 people. 14 were former bomber crew members who'd tracked him down through the Tuskegee Airmen Association. They stood in the rain at Woodlawn Cemetery and told his children things they'd never heard. How their father had circled over Regensburg for 7 hours when his P-51 was so low on fuel he'd had to glide the last 40 miles back to base. How he'd flown 5 missions with a cracked canopy that froze his face at altitude because the maintenance depot was saving the good canopies for white squadrons. How he'd turned back into attacking fighters 31 times in one mission, 31, because the Germans kept trying to draw him away and he refused to leave. The bomber crews remembered. They'd lived because someone decided that bringing them home mattered more than glory. In 2014, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture opened an exhibit on the Tuskegee Airmen. The centerpiece is a restored P-51 Mustang painted with the 392nd's distinctive red tail. A placard beside it reads, "The Red Tails never lost a bomber they escorted to enemy fighters." That's not quite accurate. They lost 25. But out of 274 bombers they protected, 25 losses was the lowest record of any fighter group in the war. The placard doesn't mention Lee Archer by name. It doesn't explain the doctrine they defied or the recognition they never received. It notes only that they achieved an unprecedented level of success in protecting American bombers. Every year about 180,000 people see that exhibit. Most spend about 90 seconds looking at the P-51 before moving to the next display. But sometimes, maybe twice a week according to museum docents, a visitor will stop and stare at that placard for a long time. And then they'll ask, how did they do that? How did they not lose bombers when everyone else did? The answer is simple. And it explains everything about innovation in war, bureaucracy, and courage. They cared about the mission more than the medals. They ignored doctrine that prioritized glory over purpose. And they did it knowing they'd receive no credit, because the men in the bombers, the men they were actually there to protect, would know the truth. Those men came home. They raised families, built businesses, taught grandchildren. They lived full lives that ended naturally, in beds surrounded by people who loved them. They lived because a group of pilots from Harlem and Chicago and Mississippi and Alabama decided that their job wasn't to shoot down Germans. Their job was to bring Americans home. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what real innovation looks like, when it's divorced from recognition and reward, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to finding and sharing these stories that institutional memory tried to erase. And leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you served or if someone you loved served. Tell us what you think about men who did the hardest thing in war. They subordinated their egos to their mission. These stories need people like you to keep them alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you to the Red Tails who understood something the generals never did, that the measure of a fighter pilot isn't how many enemies he kills. It's how many friends he brings home.